In the quiet town of Ravenshade, where nothing ever seemed to change, Willow Street sat in a long, sleepy row of houses. The street was lined with tall trees that whispered in the wind, their branches stretching over the road like thin, bony fingers. During the day, it looked peaceful, but at night it felt different, too still, too silent, as if the street itself was holding its breath. He said someone was inside the walls, and then he was found dead. At the far end stood number 17. The house didn't look much different from the others at first glance. It had pale, fading paint, a small front porch, and narrow windows that reflected the sky like dull glass eyes. But people in Ravenshade knew better than to look too long at it, because of what happened inside. 10 years ago, that house belonged to a man named Daniel Hargrove. Daniel wasn't from Ravenshade. He moved there suddenly without telling anyone much about his past. He bought the house cheaply, paid in full, and kept to himself from the very beginning. People noticed him, of course. Small towns always notice strangers. But Daniel gave them little to talk about. He was quiet, polite, but distant. He rarely left the house except to buy groceries, and even then he spoke as little as possible. The cashier at the local store once said that Daniel always looked tired, like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes would wander, drifting past people instead of looking at them, as if he was listening to something no one else could hear. Most assumed he was just another writer trying to escape the noise of the world. And in a way, they were right. Daniel spent most of his time inside, working on his typewriter late into the night. The faint clacking of keys could sometimes be heard from the street if the windows were open. It became a strange kind of comfort for the neighbors, a sign that the house wasn't completely lifeless. But over time, things began to feel off. Mrs. Alden, who lived across the street, was the first to notice something unusual. She had lived on Willow Street for over 30 years and claimed she knew every sound it made. One night, while sitting by her window, she heard something coming from Daniel's house. At first, she thought it was just the typewriter, but then she realized it wasn't. It sounded like footsteps. Not normal footsteps, slow, uneven, dragging along the floor. She leaned closer to the glass, her breath fogging the window. The lights in Daniel's house were on, but she couldn't see anyone moving inside, and yet the footsteps continued. She told herself it was nothing. Old houses make strange noises. Wood shifts, pipes creak. It happens all the time. But deep down, she knew this was different. A few days later, Daniel knocked on her door. It was the first time he had ever come to speak to her directly. When she opened the door, she barely recognized him. His face looked thinner, paler than before. Dark circles hung under his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly at his sides. "Mrs. Alden," he said quietly, his voice dry, "can I ask you something?" She nodded, a little surprised. "Of course, Daniel. What is it?" He hesitated. His eyes flickered past her shoulder, scanning the inside of her house as if checking something. Then he leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Have you ever noticed noises coming from my house, Mrs.?" Alden felt a chill run through her. "Well," she said carefully, "old houses can be noisy, no?" Daniel interrupted softly, shaking his head. "Not that kind of noise." There was a pause. Then he whispered something that would stay with her for years. "I hear someone walking inside the walls." Mrs. Alden didn't know how to respond. She tried to smile, tried to make it sound harmless. "Daniel, you're probably just tired, maybe working too much. I'm not imagining it," he said quickly. His voice was still calm, but there was something desperate underneath. "It moves at night. When I stop typing, it stops too." The silence that followed felt heavy. For a moment, Mrs. Alden considered calling someone, maybe a doctor, maybe the police, but Daniel straightened up suddenly, as if realizing how strange he sounded. "I'm sorry," he said, stepping back. "I shouldn't have said anything." And just like that, he turned and walked away. That was the last normal conversation anyone had with him. After that day, Daniel changed. The lights in his house stayed on all night. The typewriter never stopped. Neighbors began to hear strange sounds, more often soft thuds, faint scratching, and sometimes what sounded like muffled voices. No one could ever make out words, just low, shifting tones that didn't seem to belong to a single person. Some said Daniel had lost his mind, others said something else was wrong, but no one dared to get involved. Until the night it happened, it was just past midnight when a loud crash echoed through Willow Street. Several neighbors woke up, startled by the sudden noise. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, then fell silent. Mrs. Alden rushed to her window. Daniel's house was completely still. The lights were on, but nothing moved inside. No shadows, no sound, nothing. The next morning, the police arrived. By noon, the entire street knew. Daniel Hargrove was dead. He had been found inside his bedroom. The door was locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no footprints, nothing out of place. It was as if the room had sealed itself shut. The official report called it suicide, case closed, but the people of Ravenshade couldn't forget what Daniel had said. Someone is watching me from inside the house, and as the days passed, one question refused to disappear. If Daniel was alone that night, then who or what made that final noise? When the police sealed off the house on Willow Street, most people in Ravenshade thought the story had ended. Another tragedy, quietly filed away and forgotten with time. But inside that house, something had been left behind. Something no one could easily explain. During the initial investigation, officers searched every room, every drawer, every corner. Daniel Hargrove had not left behind much. Just a few clothes, stacks of typed pages, and a typewriter sitting neatly on a desk by the window. There were no signs of struggle, no broken furniture, no blood outside of what was expected. Everything felt controlled. Too controlled. It was Officer Grant who found the recorder. He had been checking under the bed in Daniel's bedroom, more out of routine than suspicion. Most of the space was empty, covered in a thin layer of dust, except for one small area near the wall. There, partially hidden in the shadows, was a small black voice recorder, old, scratched, and worn from use. At first, it didn't seem important, just another belonging. But when Grant picked it up, he noticed something strange. The device was still on. A faint red light blinked slowly, recording. "Hey," Grant called out, "you might want to hear this." The recorder was taken as evidence and brought back to the station. It wasn't examined right away. Cases like this often followed a simple path, and most officers believed they already knew the answer. But later that evening, one detective decided to listen. Her name was Laura Hayes. Detective Hayes had been with the department for over a decade. She wasn't easily shaken, and she didn't believe in jumping to conclusions. Something about the case felt unfinished to her, like a sentence missing its final word. So she sat alone in the evidence room, placed the recorder on the table, and pressed play. At first, there was nothing. Just silence, a long, empty stretch of quiet that made her wonder if the device had malfunctioned. Then a soft sound. Breathings slow, uneven. Hayes leaned closer. After a few seconds, Daniel's voice appeared, barely above a whisper. "I know you're there." There was a pause, the kind that makes your skin tighten without knowing why. "I can hear you," Daniel continued. "You don't move when I move. You wait." His voice trembled slightly, but he was trying to stay calm, trying to make sense of something he couldn't see. The sound of the typewriter keys began in the background. Click, click, clicks fast, nervous. "I thought it was the pipes," he said, "or the wood, but it's not. It's not the house." Another pause. Then, more quietly, "It's inside the walls." Hayes felt a chill crawl up her arms. The recording continued. For several minutes, Daniel spoke in fragments, sometimes to himself, sometimes as if he were speaking directly to someone. "I checked every room. There's nothing there. You stop when I listen. Why can't I see you?" Then suddenly the typing stopped. Completely, the silence that followed felt heavier than before, and that's when it happened. A second sound entered the recording. At first, it was so faint that Hayes almost missed it. A shift, a movement, then footsteps, slow, measured. Not echoing through a room, but dull, close, as if coming from behind something, or within something. Hayes held her breath. Daniel must have heard it too, because his voice returned sharper now. I knew it. The footsteps continued. One step, then another, then they stopped, right outside the range of the recorder. The silence stretched for several seconds. And then a second voice spoke. Low, calm, not rushed, not afraid, clear. You shouldn't have looked for me. Hayes froze. Her mind immediately tried to explain it away. Maybe it was a recording glitch. Maybe Daniel had layered voices, played tricks on himself. But deep down, she knew this voice didn't belong to him. On the tape, Daniel let out a shaky breath. Who are you? He whispered. No response. For a moment, it seemed like the voice had disappeared. Then a soft tapping sound echoed in the background. Not on the floor, not on furniture, inside the walls. Tappy, tap, tap. Daniel's breathing grew faster. You've been here the whole time, he said, his voice breaking. Haven't you? The tapping stopped. Another long silence, and then the voice returned, closer this time, almost beside him. I live where no one looks. Hayes felt her pulse quicken. The next few seconds were chaos. A loud crash exploded through the recording, as if something heavy had fallen or been thrown. Daniel shouted, his voice filled with panic now, no longer controlled. No, stay back. The sound of something scraping across the floor followed. Furniture moving, feet stumbling, then a sharp, sudden noise, and Daniel screamed. The recording cut off immediately after. Silence, complete silence. Hayes slowly lowered the recorder. The room around her felt colder, smaller. She replayed the final seconds again and again. Each time the same details stood out. The footsteps, the tapping, the voice. It was too precise, too real. This wasn't the sound of a man talking to himself. This was a conversation. The next morning, Hayes brought the recording to the rest of the team. Most of them dismissed it quickly. Audio distortion, one officer said. Maybe he recorded over something, or he was losing his mind, another added. Wouldn't be the first time. The official report didn't change. Cause of death, suicide, case closed. But Hayes couldn't accept it because one detail refused to leave her thoughts. The second voice didn't sound distant. It didn't sound like it was coming from across the room. It sounded close, too close, as if whoever, or whatever, was speaking had been standing right next to Daniel when he died. And yet, when the police opened that locked room, there was no one there. Years passed, but the house on Willow Street never truly faded from memory, at least not for Detective Laura Hayes. The case had been closed, filed away, and buried under newer reports. To everyone else in Ravenshade, Daniel Hargrove's death had become just another strange story whispered from time to time. People moved on, as they always do, but Hayes didn't. The recording stayed with her, not just in her thoughts, but in her instincts. Something about it didn't sit right. It wasn't just the second voice, or the fear in Daniel's words. It was the way everything fit together too perfectly. A locked room, no evidence, no suspect. It felt less like a solved case, and more like something carefully hidden. So, nearly 6 years after Daniel's death, Hayes made a decision. She reopened the investigation. Officially, she called it a review of evidence. Unofficially, she went back to the house. Number 17, Willow Street. The property had remained empty since the incident. No one wanted to buy it. No one wanted to live there. Over time, the paint peeled further, the garden dried out, and the windows gathered layers of dust. It looked abandoned, forgotten, but as Hayes stepped onto the porch, she felt something else, not emptiness. Presence. She unlocked the front door with a key from the evidence department. The wood creaked as it opened, the sound echoing into the dark interior. The air inside was stale, heavy, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. Hayes stepped in slowly, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the curtains. Every movement she made seemed too loud, the soft thud of her boots, the faint rustle of her coat. The house was exactly as it had been left. Furniture untouched, books still on the shelves, the typewriter sitting on the desk near the window. Waiting for a moment, she just stood there, listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, just silence. But it wasn't comforting. It felt watchful. She began her search methodically, moving from room to room. The living area showed no signs of disturbance. The kitchen was bare, except for a few old dishes still in the cabinets. Everything was normal, too normal, when she reached the bedroom, the place where Daniel had died. She paused. The door stood slightly open. Hayes pushed it gently, stepping inside. The room felt colder than the rest of the house. The bed was still there. The sheets had been removed long ago, leaving only the bare mattress. The walls were plain, unmarked. At first glance, nothing stood out, but Hayes wasn't looking for what was obvious. She walked slowly around the room, her eyes scanning every detail. The corners, the floor, the ceiling. Then she stopped. Something felt off. She couldn't explain it right away, but there was a difference in the way the room sounded. Her footsteps echoed differently here, slightly hollow. She crouched down and tapped lightly on the wooden floor. Solid. She stood up and knocked gently on one of the walls. Again, solid. But when she reached the wall behind the bookshelf, the sound changed. It was faint but unmistakable, hollow. Hayes froze. She knocked again, more firmly this time. A dull, empty echo responded from behind the wood. Her heart began to beat faster. Slowly, she moved the bookshelf aside. It scraped against the floor, revealing a section of the wall that looked no different from the rest. But now she knew better. She ran her fingers along the surface, feeling for any irregularity, and then she found it. A thin line, almost invisible, the outline of a panel. Carefully, she pressed against it. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a soft click, the panel shifted inward. A narrow opening appeared, dark, silent, waiting. Hayes hesitated only for a moment before pulling out her flashlight and aiming it into the space. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing a small, hidden room behind the wall. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to move comfortably. There were no windows, no lights, just rough wooden walls and a low ceiling. Hayes stepped inside. The air was different here, stale but not untouched. As if someone had been breathing it recently. Her flashlight moved slowly across the space, and that's when she saw it. Evidence, not of neglect but of life. There were old food wrappers scattered in one corner, empty cans. A plastic bottle, half crushed, on the floor. A thin blanket lay crumpled, covered in dust but not completely, as if it had been disturbed at some point. Hayes' pulse quickened. "This isn't possible," she whispered. The house had been sealed for years. No one had entered. No one had lived here, and yet this room told a different story. Her light shifted to the walls, and she froze. Scratches, deep, jagged scratches carved into the wood. Dozens of them, some short, some long and uneven, layered over each other as if made over time, not random. Intentional marks, like someone had been counting days or trying to get out. Hayes stepped closer, her breath shallow. The scratches weren't the only thing. There were faint handprints too, smudged, barely visible, pressed into the wood, at shoulder height and lower, as if someone had been leaning against the wall, listening, watching. Her mind raced. Had someone been hiding here, living inside the walls, watching Daniel? The thought made her stomach tighten. Then something else caught her attention. Near the back of the hidden room, partially tucked beneath the blanket, was a small object. Hayes crouched down and picked it up, a notebook, worn, dusty, but intact. She stared at it for a long moment before opening it, because deep down she already knew. Whatever answers this case had left, they were inside these pages. And something told her she wasn't going to like what she found. The notebook felt heavier than it should have. Detective Laura Hayes held it carefully, as if it might fall apart in her hands, or worse, reveal something she wasn't ready to see. The cover was worn and faded, its edges rough from years of use. Dust clung to it, but not thickly. Not enough to suggest it had been lying untouched for a decade. That detail alone made her uneasy. She sat down on the bare floor of the hidden room, her flashlight resting beside her, its beam casting long, narrow shadows across the scratched wooden walls. For a moment she simply stared at the notebook. Then, slowly, she opened it. The first page was filled with handwriting. Tight, careful, controlled, not Daniel's. Hayes had seen Daniel Hargrove's writing before, untyped pages, and a few handwritten notes found in the house. This was different. The letters here were sharper, more precise, almost mechanical in their consistency. At the top of the page there was no name, no date, just a single line, "I live where no one looks." Hayes frowned slightly and turned the page. More writing. This time there was a date, but it made her pause. It was from 15 years ago, 5 years before Daniel had even moved into the house. A cold feeling settled in her chest. She kept reading. "The first family never noticed me. They made too much noise. They filled the house with sound, with laughter, with arguments. It was easy to move when they weren't listening." Hayes' eyes moved faster now, scanning the words. "I learned their routines quickly, when they slept, when they left, when they locked the doors. Locks are only useful when you know what they hide." She swallowed slowly. This wasn't a journal in the normal sense. It was a record of someone watching, waiting, living in the shadows of other people's lives. She turned another page. "They left after a year, said the house felt wrong. They were right." The entries continued, each one calm and emotionless, describing different families who had lived in the house over time. None of them stayed long. Some left suddenly, some left quietly. One entry stood out. "The man in the blue coat heard me once. He stood still for a long time, listening. I didn't move. Eventually, he convinced himself it was nothing." Hayes felt a chill crawl up her spine. She could almost picture it. A man standing in the dark, sensing something just beyond his understanding, and choosing to ignore it, choosing safety over truth. She turned another page. The handwriting didn't change, but something else did. The tone, the new one, is different. "He listens too much." Hayes' grip tightened slightly. She knew who this was about. "Daniel, he works at night. That makes it harder. Silence is important. Silence is where I exist." Her heart began to beat faster. "He started hearing me 3 nights ago. Not clearly, not yet, but he knows something is wrong." Hayes stopped for a moment, her eyes lifting from the page. The hidden room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. She looked around, her flashlight beam sweeping across the scratched walls, the narrow space, the low ceiling. This was where the writer had lived, watched, waited. She looked back down at the notebook. The entries became more frequent now. More focused. "He taps on the walls. He is searching. He moved the shelf today. He is close." Hayes' breath slowed. This was it. The moment everything had changed. She turned the page carefully. "He found the door." The words were written slightly darker than the others, as if pressed harder into the paper. He looked inside. For a moment we saw each other. Hayes felt her chest tighten. The idea of that moment, Daniel, standing in his room, discovering the hidden panel, opening it, looking into the darkness, and seeing someone looking back. He was afraid. That is normal. The next line made her stomach drop. "But he shouldn't have looked for me." Hayes' mind immediately flashed back to the recording. The voice, the exact same words. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the final page, the last entry. "Dated the night Daniel died. He won't stop now. He keeps listening. He keeps asking questions." There was a long gap beneath those lines. Then at the very bottom of the page, written more slowly, "Now I have to finish it." Hayes closed the notebook slowly. The silence in the hidden room felt louder than before. Her thoughts raced, trying to connect everything. This wasn't just a hidden space. It was a place someone had lived for years, maybe longer. Watching the people in the house, learning them, waiting, and when someone came too close, they didn't leave, they were removed. Hayes stood up quickly, her flashlight shaking slightly in her hand. The beam flickered across the walls again, over the scratches, the blanket, the empty food wrappers. Every detail now felt different, more real, more dangerous. She stepped backward toward the narrow opening in the wall. But as she did, she froze. There was a sound, faint, so faint she almost thought she imagined it, a soft shift. Behind her, Hayes turned sharply, her light cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The room was empty. Exactly as it had been. She stood there for several seconds, listening. Her pulse echoed in her ears. No movement, no breathing, nothing. Slowly she exhaled. "It's just the house," she whispered to herself. Old wood, settling, that's all. But as she stepped out of the hidden room and pulled herself back into the bedroom, one thought refused to leave her mind. If someone had been living in that space, if someone had written that notebook, if someone had spoken on that recording, then where were they now? Because one thing was painfully clear: no one had ever found a body, no one had ever found a suspect. And yet someone had been there, watching, waiting for years. The man who was never seen had never been caught. And deep down, Hayes was starting to realize something even worse. Maybe he was never gone. The morning after Detective Laura Hayes left the house on Willow Street, she told herself she needed distance. The notebook, the hidden room, the scratches on the walls, it all felt too heavy, too connected. Her logical mind kept trying to separate facts from fear, but something deeper had already taken root. Doubt, and doubt was something she couldn't ignore anymore. For the first time since reopening the case, Hayes filed a formal request to bring in a full forensic team. She wanted proof, hard evidence, something that could explain the hidden room without bending reality into something unrecognizable. But before approval came through, something strange happened. The house changed, at least that's what the neighbors claimed. Mrs. Alden, now much older, told police she saw lights inside number 17 at night. Not steady lights like a lamp, but flickering movement like someone walking through rooms with a flashlight. Another neighbor said they heard faint knocking on the walls, slow, rhythmic, like tapping. But when officers checked the house again, everything was still. Silent, empty, no signs of entry, no footprints in the dust, nothing. Hayes arrived with the forensic team 2 days later. This time the house felt different, not abandoned, not forgotten, occupied. She didn't say it out loud, but she felt it the moment she stepped inside. The air was warmer than before, not by much, but enough to notice, enough to make her pause. The team spread out, checking each room carefully. Cameras were set up, dust samples were taken, walls were scanned. Still, no immediate results came. Everything remained frustratingly normal until they reached the bedroom, the same room where Daniel Hargrove had died, the same room where the hidden panel had been found. One of the technicians placed a thermal scanner against the wall behind the bookshelf. At first, nothing unusual appeared, then a faint reading. Hayes stepped closer. "What is it?" she asked. The technician frowned. "There's a temperature difference here," he said, behind the wall. Another scan. Then another, each time the same result, a hollow space. But when they broke through the wall again carefully, this time under controlled conditions, they found something shocking. The hidden room was empty, completely empty. No blanket, no food wrappers, no notebook, no scratches. Nothing. The wood was smooth, clean, untouched, as if no one had ever been inside. Hayes stared at it, confused. "That's impossible," she said quietly. The technician checked again, same result, no biological traces. No dust disturbance, no fingerprints. It looked like a sealed wall that had never been opened. But Hayes knew what she had seen before. She had been inside that room, she had held that notebook, she had seen the scratches, so where had it all gone? The case began to fall apart again. Forensic reports contradicted her findings. Some suggested contamination. Others suggested memory error or misinterpretation of the structure. One officer even quietly suggested stress-related hallucination. Hayes didn't respond. She couldn't, because that night something else arrived, a package delivered anonymously to the station. No return address, no label, just her name written neatly on the front. Inside was a single object. The voice recorder, the same recorder from Daniel Hargrove's case, the same one locked in evidence storage. Hayes felt her stomach drop the moment she saw it. She didn't remember authorizing its release. No one did. She stepped into an empty room, closed the door, and stared at it for a long time. Then she pressed play. Silence, then breathing, slow, controlled. Hayes froze. Daniel's voice followed. "I told you it doesn't end when you close the door." Her pulse quickened instantly. The recording was new, not from the original night. This was something else, something recent. "You went back." Daniel's voice continued softly. You opened it again. Hayes' mouth went dry. That wasn't possible. No one had known she returned to the house except the forensic team. And they hadn't released anything. The voice continued, "You shouldn't have done that." Then a pause. A long one, followed by a sound Hayes remembered too well, tapping inside walls, slow, measured, tap, tap, tap. Her hand tightened around the recorder. "This isn't real," she whispered, but her voice sounded uncertain. The tapping stopped, then the second voice returned. Calm, close, closer than before. "You found what was hidden." Hayes looked around the room instinctively, even though she was alone. The voice continued, but you didn't understand it. A sharp sound suddenly came through the recorder. Like wood shifting, like something moving, then a final whisper. "I still live where no one looks." The recording ended. Silence. Hayes stood frozen, unable to move for several seconds. Then slowly, she placed the recorder on the table. Her mind raced. The hidden room had been empty. The evidence had disappeared. The recorder had been stolen and returned without explanation. None of it made sense, and yet all of it pointed to the same impossible idea. Something was controlling what people saw, what they remembered, what they believed existed. That night, Hayes drove home later than usual. The streets of Ravenshade were quiet. Too quiet. Every house she passed looked dark, sleeping, normal, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her through them. When she reached her apartment, she locked the door immediately, checked the windows, checked the closets, then stopped because for the first time in years she remembered Daniel's words, "I hear someone walking inside the walls." Hayes stood still in the middle of her living room. Listening. At first there was nothing, just silence, then a sound, faint, from somewhere she couldn't place. A soft tap. Her eyes slowly moved toward the wall beside her. Tap, another one. Her breath caught. She stepped backward slowly, eyes fixed on the wall. And in that moment, Detective Laura Hayes realized something she had refused to accept since the beginning. The case had never been about Daniel Hargrove. It had never been about a suicide. It had never even been about a hidden room. It was about something that lived in places people stopped noticing. And once you noticed it, it noticed you back. The final tap echoed through the apartment, and this time it didn't stop.